You'll probably think I'm crazy. Hell, I thought I was losing my mind the first few days after it happened. But I need to tell you this story because it changed everything I thought I knew about what might be living in our forests. What happened to me out in the Oregon wilderness 3 years ago still sends a chill through me, not in the way you'd expect. I was on a solo camping trip in the Cascades, about 40 miles northeast of Bend. That's remote country out there, the kind of place you can hike for days without running into another soul. I'd been planning the trip for months, needing to get away from the city and clear my head after a divorce. Just me, my tent, and enough supplies to last a week in the woods. The first 2 days were perfect. Clear skies, crisp mountain air, and that deep, quiet silence you only find in the backcountry. I set up camp in a small clearing by a stream, surrounded by towering old Douglas firs that felt like cathedral columns. By day, I hiked unmarked trails, and by night, I sat by my campfire, staring at the stars and feeling like the last person on Earth. But on the third night, something changed. I was zipped into my sleeping bag around midnight when I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Crying. Not an animal call, something disturbingly human. It sounded like a child sobbing in the distance, lost and terrified. The sound drifted through the trees from somewhere northwest of my camp, faint but unmistakable. I shot upright, heart pounding, straining to listen. The crying came in waves, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, like whatever it was kept wandering aimlessly through the woods. My rational brain tried to explain it away, maybe an owl or wind through the branches, or some other wildlife I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew this wasn't any normal sound of the forest. The cries went on for nearly an hour before they slowly faded. I barely slept the rest of the night, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but determined to investigate. The sound had been too human, too desperate to ignore. If someone really was out there, maybe a lost hiker, even a child, I couldn't just pack up and leave. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I loaded my backpack with water, some food, and a first aid kit. I clipped my GPS to my belt, made sure my knife was within reach, and headed northwest toward where the crying had come from, a stretch of forest I hadn't explored yet. The terrain grew rougher, choked with brush and fallen logs. Faint, almost invisible game trails twisted through the area. I moved slowly, stopping often to listen. The forest was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, just the wind whispering through the treetops. About 2 miles from camp, I came across something that stopped me cold. Pressed into a patch of soft earth by a creek was a footprint like nothing I'd ever seen. It was vaguely human-shaped, but enormous, at least 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide. The toes were clearly defined, much longer than a human's, and there was no sign of shoes or boots. Whatever made it was walking barefoot through the forest. My hands shook as I snapped photos with my camera. I'd read stories about tracks like these online, but seeing one in person was something else entirely. The print was fresh, probably left within the past day or two, and sunk deep into the mud as if made by tremendous weight. I followed the trail along the creek for half a mile, my fear and excitement rising with each massive footprint. Then, I heard it again, the crying. Closer this time. It came from just ahead, beyond a thicket of trees. I crept forward as quietly as I could, pushing through brush until I could peer into a small clearing by the creek. And what I saw there made me question my own sanity. Sitting on the ground about 50 feet away was a young Bigfoot, something straight out of a legend, covered in dark brown hair from head to toe, with a face more human than any ape I'd ever seen. But this wasn't the creature that had made the giant prints. This was clearly a juvenile, maybe 4 feet tall, with proportions that reminded me of a human child. And it was in trouble. Its left ankle was caught in what looked like an old snare trap, a steel cable twisted tight around its leg. The area around the trap was raw and bloody. The young Bigfoot was exhausted from struggling to free itself. It slumped against a fallen log, tugging weakly at the wire every now and then, and those heartbreaking cries I'd heard, they belonged to this creature. I crouched behind a tree, trying to process what I was looking at. This was a Bigfoot, a living, breathing Sasquatch. But it wasn't the terrifying monster from movies and legends. It was just a scared, injured child that needed help. The young Sasquatch looked awful. Its fur was matted and filthy, and I could see its ribs showing through the hair on its sides. It had clearly been trapped for days, maybe longer, slowly starving and dehydrating while its family searched for it somewhere out there in the vast wilderness. I watched for nearly 20 minutes, torn between disbelief and a growing sense of urgency. The young Bigfoot was dying. Even if its family eventually found it, they might not be able to free it from the snare. And by then, it could be too late. Finally, I made the decision that would change my life forever. I stepped out from behind the tree and slowly moved into the clearing. The young Bigfoot spotted me instantly and let out a sharp, frightened cry. It tried to bolt, but the trap bit deeper into its ankle, and it collapsed with a pained shriek. We stared at each other across 30 feet of forest floor, a terrified juvenile Sasquatch and a stunned human, both unsure what to do next. I held my hands out to show I wasn't carrying any weapons, then slowly sat down on a log. The young Bigfoot watched me with wide, intelligent eyes that seemed disturbingly human. There was fear in them, but also something else, a desperate flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I was there to help. For the next hour, I worked my way closer in tiny increments. I'd move a few feet, then sit quietly until it calmed down before edging closer again. I spoke to it in a soft, soothing voice, the same way you might talk to a frightened dog. I had no idea if it understood a word I was saying, but the tone seemed to reassure it. When I finally got close enough to examine the trap, my stomach sank. The wire had cut deep into its ankle. The flesh was swollen, badly infected. Worse, the snare was attached to a heavy steel stake driven deep into the ground. This wasn't some accidental tangle. Someone had set this trap deliberately, probably years ago, and never bothered to check it. I pulled out my multi-tool and flipped open the blade. The young Sasquatch flinched at the glint of metal, but I kept talking in that calm voice, explaining what I was about to do even though I had no idea if it could comprehend. Carefully, I reached for the trap. The creature could have lashed out. Its arms were longer than mine, and even at its young age, it was clearly far stronger than any human child. But it seemed to understand that I was trying to help. It held perfectly still while I slid the blade under the wire, sawing gently, careful not to cut its skin. Finally, the cable snapped. The Bigfoot immediately tried to stand, but its injured leg couldn't bear any weight. It collapsed again with a painful moan. Without thinking, I grabbed my water bottle from my pack and held it out. The creature sniffed it cautiously, then seized it with both hands and drank desperately. In seconds, it had drained the entire 20-ounce bottle, water running down its chin and soaking into the fur on its chest. When it finished, it looked at me with what I can only describe as gratitude. I tore open a granola bar, took a bite myself, and then offered it the rest. The young Sasquatch watched intently, sniffed the food, and then took a tentative bite. Its eyes widened. It had clearly never tasted chocolate or peanuts before. Within minutes, it had devoured 3 granola bars and a whole bag of trail mix. While it ate, I inspected its ankle more closely. The cable had sliced through the skin in several places, and the wounds were badly infected. I had only a basic first aid kit with me, and I wasn't sure how it would react to being touched again. I pulled out antiseptic wipes and gauze, holding them up so the young Bigfoot could see what I was doing. To my surprise, it seemed to understand that these items were meant for healing. Maybe its family had their own way of treating injuries, but when I reached for its ankle, it let me clean the wound and wrap it with fresh gauze. Up close, the creature was fascinating. Its face was more human than ape, with a broad nose and expressive eyes that seemed to reveal genuine emotion. Its hands were enormous but incredibly dexterous, able to manipulate small objects with surprising precision. It was clearly intelligent. After I showed it how to tear open a granola bar wrapper, it immediately understood and was able to open the next one by itself. But what struck me most was how young and vulnerable it seemed. Covered in fur, standing 4 feet tall, it still carried an unmistakably childlike air. The way it clutched my water bottle after drinking, the way it followed every movement of mine with wide, curious eyes, the way it seemed to relax just being near me, it reminded me of a lost toddler finally finding a safe adult. As the afternoon wore on, I realized the creature would never be able to make it back to wherever its family was waiting. Its ankle was too damaged, and it was still weak from hunger and dehydration. I'd have to help it. But how could I possibly track down a Sasquatch family in thousands of square miles of wilderness? So I made another decision, one that terrified me as soon as it formed. I would bring the young creature back to my camp and care for it until its family found us. And deep down, I was becoming convinced that they would. Something that intelligent would never abandon its young, not even in a forest this vast. Getting the young Bigfoot back to camp turned into an adventure of its own. It couldn't put any weight on its injured leg, but it was determined to follow me rather than be carried. We moved slowly, with the creature using fallen logs and my shoulder for support as it hopped along on one leg. The hike that normally took me 2 hours stretched into nearly 5. But at last, we made it back to the little clearing by the stream. I rigged up a temporary shelter for it using my tarp and some broken branches, forming a lean-to against a large boulder about 20 feet from my tent. The young Sasquatch seemed to understand this space was meant for it. It crawled inside and curled up on the bed of pine boughs I had gathered. It watched me with those intelligent eyes as I moved around camp. That first night was surreal. I cooked dinner while a young Sasquatch rested in a shelter only a few yards away. I shared my freeze-dried beef stew with it, and it ate with obvious delight, making soft, low sounds I understood as satisfaction. As darkness fell, I built up my campfire and settled into my chair, listening to the steady breathing of the creature from its shelter. Around midnight, a sound froze my blood. It was a call from deep in the forest, a long, haunting howl that echoed off the mountains and seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The young Bigfoot immediately sat up and answered with its own vocalizations, a series of clicks and low growls that sounded like a language. The calls went on for nearly an hour, coming from multiple directions around my camp. That's when it hit me. We were surrounded. The creature's family had found us, and they were trying to figure out whether their young one was safe or whether I was a threat that needed to be dealt with. I spent the rest of the night sitting by my fire, fully aware that I was being watched from the darkness beyond the circle of light. Every so often, I caught the faintest movement between the trees, huge shapes vanishing the moment I tried to focus on them. The young Sasquatch seemed completely calm, occasionally calling back to the voices in the woods. I, on the other hand, was terrified. When dawn broke, I found proof we'd had visitors in the night, enormous footprints circling my campsite, and several of my things had been moved or inspected. My camp stove had been picked up and set down in a different spot. A spare water bottle had been opened and sniffed. Nothing was damaged or stolen. It was more like a careful investigation than any sort of threat. In the days that followed, I settled into a strange routine with my unusual companion. The young Bigfoot recovered quickly from its ordeal. Its appetite was enormous, easily twice what I could eat, and it was always hungry. I shared everything I had, and we both began losing weight as my supplies dwindled. But the creature was learning at an astonishing pace. I showed it which plants around camp were edible, and it immediately began foraging on its own. When I demonstrated how to catch bait fish in the stream with my hands, it quickly mastered the technique and proved far better at it than me. It seemed to grasp cause and effect in ways that surprised me, like when I showed it how I used stones to build my fire ring, and it began bringing me the right-sized rocks without being asked. Most striking of all was how clearly it seemed to understand that I was trying to help. Each morning, when I changed the bandages on its ankle, it would sit perfectly still and even lift its leg to make the job easier. When I went to gather firewood, it would hobble around camp and stack kindling by the fire pit. It was like having a very large, very unusual camping partner. But I was becoming more and more aware that we were still being watched. Every morning brought new evidence of nighttime visitors, tracks in the mud by the stream, branches broken at heights only something 8 feet tall could reach. And there were gifts. Fresh fish carefully laid on a flat rock, berries stacked neatly in piles, even wildflowers placed intentionally around the young Bigfoot's shelter. I realized its family was looking after both of us. They were supplying food and watching over their child, but also making sure I had what I needed to keep helping. It was a level of planning and cooperation that shattered everything I thought I knew about animal intelligence. On the 5th morning, everything changed. I woke to find the young Bigfoot sitting outside its shelter, completely still, staring intently into the trees. It had been much more active the last few days, and its ankle had healed enough to bear some weight. But now it seemed frozen with anticipation. I followed its gaze and felt my heart stop. Standing at the edge of the clearing, no more than 50 feet away, was the largest creature I have ever seen in my life. An adult Bigfoot. It was easily 8 feet tall, built like an NFL linebacker blown up by 50%. Its shoulders were massive, arms hanging all the way to its knees, and its face was something between human and utterly alien. Dark brown hair covered nearly every inch of its body, except for the palms of its hands and the areas around its eyes and mouth. But what struck me most wasn't its size, it was the intelligence in its eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast. It was thinking, evaluating, deciding what to do about me. And right now it was weighing whether I was a friend or a threat. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The young Sasquatch made a softer vocalization, clearly trying to communicate something to the adult. At last, the massive creature began to move forward. I have never in my life been so terrified. Even moving slowly, the adult Bigfoot covered ground with frightening ease. Each step made the earth tremble faintly. When it was about 20 feet away, I caught its scent, a wild, musky odor, unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It stopped just 10 feet from me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it. Then, to my shock, the giant knelt. Even on its knees, it was nearly as tall as me standing. It extended one huge hand toward the young Sasquatch. The child immediately limped forward and pressed itself against the adult's side, making happy, bubbling noises. The reunion was raw, emotional, and unmistakably powerful. Then the adult turned its gaze on me. It studied my face for a long moment, and then its eyes moved to the bandages wrapped around the child's injured ankle. With a gentleness almost impossible for something so massive, it lifted the young one's leg and inspected the crude first aid job I had done. What happened next still gives me chills. The adult Bigfoot looked directly into my eyes and made a sound I can only describe as gratitude. It was a deep, resonant vocalization that seemed to rise from the core of its chest, but the meaning was clear. It was thanking me. Over the next several hours, my camp became the scene of something extraordinary, a family reunion. The adult female, because by then I was certain she was the mother, was joined by several others, one by one, as they stepped from the trees. Enormous shapes revealed themselves from shadows where I would have sworn nothing could hide. In the end, there were at least 6 adults of varying sizes, plus 2 more juveniles who appeared to be siblings of the one I had helped. The family's joy at recovering their lost child was undeniable. They groomed the young one, checked its wound, and communicated in a complex mix of vocalizations, gestures, and what looked startlingly like sign language. But they didn't ignore me. The mother brought me gifts. A fresh salmon clearly caught that morning, berries I didn't recognize but that tasted incredible, and even what appeared to be medicinal plants. When I accepted these offerings with obvious gratitude, I saw something like approval flicker in her intelligent eyes. I spent the rest of that day witnessing one of the most remarkable scenes of my life. The mother and the other adults took over care of the injured juvenile, using methods that seemed far more advanced than my crude first aid. They cleaned the young one's wound with plants that clearly had antiseptic properties, crafted poultices from materials I couldn't identify, and rewrapped its ankle with what looked like woven plant fibers. But they didn't just treat it, they taught. I watched as the mother showed her child which berries were safe to eat, how to catch fish barehanded, and how to move silently through the forest despite its size. The other adults took turns demonstrating different survival skills, and the young Bigfoot learned with the same quick intelligence I'd been seeing since our time together began. What surprised me most was how they included me. When the mother was teaching her child about edible plants, she'd show me too, gesturing to make sure I understood. When one of the adults demonstrated an especially effective fishing technique, they waited for me to try it myself. I realized I'd been temporarily adopted by their family group. They'd accepted me not just as the human who had helped their child, but as a member, however brief, of their community. It was an honor I could never have imagined. As evening approached, I could sense the family preparing to leave. They'd stayed in one place as long as they dared. It was time to retreat deeper into the wilderness, where they would be safe from human discovery. The child's ankle had healed enough to travel, especially with the support of its family. But before they left, something extraordinary happened. The young Sasquatch came up to me one last time, carrying something in its hand, a small pouch woven from plant fibers, filled with what looked like seeds and dried berries. It pressed the gift into my palm and then, very gently, touched my cheek with one enormous finger. The mother approached next. She placed a beautifully woven mat at my feet, then stepped back and made the same low, resonant sound of gratitude I had heard before. Other family members added their own gifts, wooden objects carved with shapes I couldn't identify, stones etched with strange markings, bundles of plants that smelled medicinal. As dusk fell, the family gathered at the edge of my camp. The young Bigfoot looked back at me one last time, raised its hand in a gesture that looked unmistakably like a wave, and then disappeared into the trees with its kin. Within minutes, they were gone so completely, I could almost have believed I'd imagined the whole encounter if not for the gifts piled around my fire. I spent one more night in that clearing, but I barely slept. The forest felt different now, not empty, but watchful. I had the sense that I was still being observed, still being protected by the creatures who had accepted me as a friend. The next morning, I broke camp and began the long hike back to my truck. Even on the trek out of the wilderness, I occasionally caught glimpses of movement in the trees. They were watching me, making sure I returned safely to the human world. When I finally reached my vehicle and started the drive home, it felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. For 6 incredible days, I had been part of something most people will never experience: true contact with a species that shares our world but stays hidden from it. I've returned to that area many times since, always hoping for another encounter. I've never seen that family again, but I've found signs of their presence: footprints along the stream where I camped, stones carefully arranged in patterns that might be signs or messages. Once, I even found a small woven basket hanging from a tree branch right where my old campsite had been. It was as if someone wanted me to know they remembered. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still uncovering. I look at the forest differently now, aware that it may hold an intelligence we've never truly acknowledged. I've become an advocate for wilderness conservation, understanding that we're not just protecting trees and wildlife, but perhaps an entire hidden civilization that depends on the last wild places we've left. I've never told this story to anyone but a handful of close friends. Most of them think I'm either lying or suffered some kind of psychological break from the stress of my divorce. I understand their skepticism. I probably would have reacted the same way if someone had told me this 3 years ago. But I know what I experienced. I have the gifts to prove it, including that small woven pouch the young Bigfoot gave me. Experts have examined the plant fibers, but they can't identify the weaving technique or even some of the materials. The craftsmanship is unlike anything in known human cultures. More important than the artifacts, though, I carry the memory of those intelligent eyes capable of recognition, gratitude, and acceptance. I helped save the life of a Bigfoot, a being that by all mainstream science shouldn't exist. In return, I was welcomed into a family that most humans will never even know is there. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard those cries in the woods that night. Would the young Bigfoot have died alone in that trap? Would its family have found it in time? I'll never know. But I'm grateful I was there when I was needed. The wilderness holds secrets most of us can't even imagine. Ancient intelligence has learned how to avoid human contact. Hidden societies survive in the last places we haven't paved over. Families care for their young with the same devotion we give ours. My encounter was just a fleeting glimpse of that hidden world, but it was enough to change everything I thought I knew about what's possible. Every time I see a news story about deforestation or new development in wild areas, I think about that family. I wonder if they're still safe, still hidden, still caring for their young, deep in the forests where no human has walked, but which are now being encroached upon. I hope they are. We share this planet with more than we know, and some secrets are worth keeping. I still return to that forest whenever I can, often alone, always hoping. Not because I need proof of what I experienced, but because I want them to know that some people can be trusted, that some of us understand the importance of keeping their secrets safe. That if they ever needed help again, someone would be willing to give it without asking anything in return, except the privilege of knowing they exist. The last time I went back, I left my own gift, a small pile of energy bars and a note sealed in plastic, placed carefully on the same rock where they had once left fish for me. The note simply read, "Thank you for trusting me." When I returned the next day, the food was gone. In its place was a single perfect feather from a bird I couldn't identify, placed exactly where my note had been. They're still out there, still watching, still remembering the human who helped one of their own. Knowing that fills me with a peace I've never felt before. We are not alone in this world. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very quiet, we get a chance to prove that different species can care for one another across the vast divide that usually separates us. That's all I ever wanted from this experience, the knowledge that compassion can bridge any gap even between species that aren't supposed to exist. I found a lost, hungry young Sasquatch in the forest, and what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about our world and our place within it.